My name is Dr. Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I am the chief emergency physician at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago. Which means that on any given shift, I make life and death decisions about complete strangers with the specific, trained calm of someone who has learned that hesitation in an emergency department is the most expensive luxury available. I say that because I want you to understand who I am before I tell you who my family decided I was. In the emergency department, I am the person everyone calls when the situation is beyond ordinary management. I read the vitals, I assess the presentation, I order the interventions, and I make the call. Clearly, correctly, without the luxury of extended deliberation. Because the patient on the gurney does not have time for my uncertainty. In my family, I was the bad luck child. Those two things existed simultaneously for 29 years, and the distance between them is the story I am about to tell you. It was raining on the evening they came to my door, not the gentle, cinematic rain of a scene designed to communicate melancholy. The actual, aggressive Chicago rain of a November evening, the kind that comes sideways and finds the gap between your collar and your neck, regardless of what you are wearing. I was in the kitchen when the security panel on the wall beside the refrigerator chimed, the specific two-tone chime of the front gate camera activating, which it does when someone approaches the intercom. Daniel was in his home office. I could hear him on a call. The low, measured cadence of a man discussing logistics contracts with the specific, unshowy authority of someone who has earned the right to speak that way. Through 8 years of building something from nothing. I looked at the security panel. The camera feed showed 4 people standing at the gate in the rain. I recognized all of them. My father, Richard, 60 years old, in a coat I had not seen before. Not his good coat. The one he wore to the occasions he considered worth dressing for. A different coat. Older. The coat of a man whose wardrobe has contracted. My mother, Diane, 56, standing slightly behind him with the specific, compressed posture of a woman who has spent her life managing other people's impressions and is currently failing at managing her own. My sister, Sophia, 32, who had not looked at me directly since the wedding. Jason's wedding, her wedding, the wedding that had happened 9 years ago, after my parents spent 6 weeks carefully dismantling the relationship I had built with a man I had loved. And Jason Mitchell, 31, who stood at the back of the group, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the wet gravel of the driveway. Not looking at the camera, not looking at anything in particular, with the specific, interior quality of someone who has been looking at the floor of a lot of rooms lately. I stood in my kitchen and looked at the security panel for approximately 45 seconds. Then I went to get Daniel. I need to go back 9 years. Not because the story requires a long preamble. It does not. The story is simple enough in its structure, which is part of what makes it so specific and so recognizable to anyone who has lived inside a family system, organized around a hierarchy they did not choose. I go back 9 years because the evening at the gate does not make sense without the evening. 9 years earlier when I understood. With the cold, clarifying precision of someone receiving a diagnosis they had suspected, but not confirmed, exactly what my family thought of me. I was 20 years old, the year my father's business collapsed. I was also, by what my parents considered a significant coincidence, born the same year the business was founded. 20 years of growth, followed by the specific, catastrophic failure of a company that had over-leveraged itself in a real estate market that did not cooperate with its projections, a story that was not unusual in that year. And that was not my fault, in any causal sense that a reasonable person could establish. My parents were not, in this context, reasonable people. They were people who needed an explanation for what had happened to them, and who found, in the coincidence of timing, an explanation that was emotionally satisfying in the specific way that irrational explanations are emotionally satisfying. It assigned agency to something concrete, it located the cause in a single, identifiable source, and it relieved them of the responsibility of examining the actual decisions that had produced the actual outcome. I was the concrete thing. I was the identifiable source. My father never said it directly. He did not sit me down and explain that he held me responsible for the collapse of his business. He communicated it. the way that families communicate the things they do not say directly. Through the architecture of attention and resources, and the specific, consistent pattern of whose needs were urgent and whose were not. Sophia's school fees were paid without discussion. My scholarship applications were reviewed with the particular, distracted energy of someone completing a formality. They do not expect to produce results. Sophia's career milestones were celebrated at family dinners, with the specific warm enthusiasm of parents, who considered her success a reflection of their own wisdom. My medical school acceptance was acknowledged with a nod and a comment from my father about the cost of the program. I paid for medical school myself, loans, scholarships, and the specific, grinding financial discipline of someone who has understood since the age of 20 that she is building her life with the resources she generates, rather than the resources her family provides. By 29, I had paid off my loans, completed my residency, accepted the position at Northwestern Memorial, and moved into a house in a neighborhood that my mother described, at the one family dinner I had attended in the previous 2 years, as very nice for someone starting out. I had not been starting out for several years, but the family's understanding of me had not updated to reflect the actual data. If you have ever been the person in your family whose achievements were consistently filed under the category of pleasant surprises, rather than expected outcomes, drop a comment, because that specific experience produces a particular kind of exhaustion that is different from ordinary tiredness. It is the exhaustion of someone who has been disproving a thesis for so long that the disproving itself has become the primary relationship with the people who hold the thesis. Jason Mitchell came into my life in my 3rd year of residency. I want to be precise about how I felt about him, because the easy version of this story would have me describe him as someone I was naive about or blinded by, and I do not think that is accurate. I was not naive. I was a 3rd-year emergency medicine resident with the specific sleep-deprived clarity of someone whose professional environment does not leave much room for self-deception. I saw Jason Mitchell accurately. His charm, his ambition, his genuine intelligence about the technology sector he operated in, and also his materialism, his sensitivity to status, and the specific way he assessed rooms by the quality of people in them before he assessed them by anything else. I saw all of that. I chose him anyway. Because the qualities I loved were real, and the qualities I was cautious about seemed, in the context of a relationship with someone who was not his professional environment, manageable. I was wrong about the manageable part, but the person who made them unmanageable was not Jason. I introduced him to my family at a Sunday dinner in March. I had been deliberate about the timing. March was after the worst of the winter, when my parents' moods tended to be slightly less compressed by the specific, seasonal weight of a Chicago winter. I had chosen a Sunday because Sunday dinners had always been the family event where my father was most relaxed, where the formal performance of the family's self-presentation was slightly softer than it was at events that required dressing up. I had prepared, in the way that I prepared for presentations in the emergency department, by anticipating the likely variables and thinking through the responses. What I had not anticipated was Sophia, not specifically. I had anticipated that Sophia would find Jason interesting, because Sophia found wealthy, successful men interesting, with the reliable consistency of a professional orientation rather than a personal one. What I had not anticipated was the specific speed and focus of her interest. The way she moved through that Sunday dinner, with the precise, targeted attention of someone who has identified an objective and is executing toward it. She sat beside him. She asked him questions about his company, with the specific, intelligent attention of someone who has researched the subject before the conversation. She laughed at things he said, with the specific timing of someone who understands that laughter, deployed correctly, is a form of attention that most people find irresistible. And she looked at me, twice, across the table, the look of a woman who has decided that the thing in front of her is more important than the relationship with the person it belongs to, and who has already factored the cost of that decision into her calculation and found it acceptable. I drove home from that Sunday dinner with the specific, uncomfortable knowledge that I had introduced something into a room that was not going to come back out the way I had brought it in. I was right. The 6 weeks that followed were the 6 weeks my parents spent dismantling my relationship with Jason Mitchell. I know the outline of what they did, because Jason told me, years later, in a conversation I will describe in the appropriate chapter. I know the specific content of some of it, and the general shape of all of it, and I want to be fair about my parents in the way that the situation warrants fairness. They were not creative in their methods. They used the specific, ordinary tools of a family that wants a particular outcome and is willing to construct the narrative required to produce it. They told Jason I was unstable. The specific, clinical-sounding word that carries more weight when said about a doctor, because the implication that someone who works in mental health-adjacent environments might have personal struggles with the same territory is a suggestion that requires no evidence to land. They told Jason I wanted his money, a claim that required them to ignore the fact that I was a physician in the final stages of a residency that would result in a salary considerably higher than his at the time. But that worked because it confirmed a suspicion that wealthy people are susceptible to about people who enter their lives during periods of financial asymmetry. They told Jason I was jealous of Sophia, which was, in the specific, ironic way of things that contain a grain of something true, while being fundamentally false, the closest thing to an accurate statement in the collection. I was not jealous of Sophia. I was tired of the family system that organized itself around her. Those are different things, and the difference matters, but the difference requires a careful explanation that my parents did not provide, and that Jason, receiving the information through the specific channel of 2 people he had met at a Sunday dinner, and who had charmed him with the specific practiced warmth of parents performing approval, did not think to request. He broke up with me in a phone call. After 8 months, the specific cowardly medium of someone who has decided that the conversation does not require the respect of a face. He said, I think we want different things. I said, what things? He said, I've been talking to your family. I think they know you better than I realized. I did not say what I wanted to say. I said, okay, Jason. I put the phone down. I went back to work. 3 months later, he married Sophia. I found out from a cousin who sent me a photograph from the wedding. A large wedding, the specific, performed extravagance of an event designed to communicate status rather than celebrate a relationship. Sophia in a dress that photographed well. Jason in a suit that communicated exactly the right things about his tax bracket. My parents in the front row. I looked at that photograph for approximately 30 seconds. Then I filed it in the specific interior location, where I stored things that had been confirmed rather than things that were still in question. The question had been, did my family value me? The photograph was the answer. I filed it. I went back to work. Daniel Brooks came into my life 3 months after Jason's wedding through the specific, graceless mechanism of an arranged meeting that my mother orchestrated with the particular, guilty energy of someone who understands they have done something that requires compensation and is attempting to provide it in the currency available to them. She called me on a Saturday morning and said, without the preamble that the situation might have warranted, there is someone we would like you to meet. His name is Daniels Brooks. He is Richard's colleague's nephew. He is reliable. The pause before reliable told me everything about how Daniel had been described to my mother and how my mother had processed that description. I said, how old is he? She said, 33. I said, what does he do? She said, he works in retail sales. He is steady. The second word that communicated a category. The category of men who are not going anywhere in particular but will not cause problems on the way. I said, okay, Mom, not because I wanted to meet Daniel Brooks, because I was 29 years old, and I had spent the previous 3 months working 70-hour weeks in a residency program that left no time for the ordinary mechanisms of meeting people. And because the energy required to resist my mother's arrangements was energy I did not have available in sufficient quantity, and because some part of me, the part that reads situations accurately rather than the part that manages them emotionally, had calculated that the cost of agreeing was lower than the cost of the sustained campaign of resistance that disagreement would produce. I met Daniel Brooks on a Sunday afternoon at a restaurant my mother had selected. He was already there when I arrived, seated at the table, not on his phone, looking at the menu with the focused attention of someone who reads menus rather than performing the reading of them. He stood when I approached. He was not what I would call conventionally striking, but he had the specific, quiet physical presence of someone who occupies their own body with comfort rather than self-consciousness. He said, "Dr. Carter, I've been looking forward to meeting you." Not, "You look beautiful," the reflexive, performative opener of a man who has decided that the date requires a compliment as an entry point. Something direct and specific and slightly formal that communicated that he had thought about this meeting before arriving at it. I said, "Just Emily is fine," he said. "Emily, I should tell you up front. I know this is arranged. I know that probably isn't ideal." I thought it was better to acknowledge that than to pretend we happened to end up at the same table. I looked at him across the menu. I said, "That's a reasonable approach." He said, "I've been told I'm steady." Something in his expression, not quite amusement, more the dry, controlled acknowledgement of someone who knows exactly how they have been described and has decided to address it directly, rather than pretend the description wasn't made. I said, "I've been told you work in retail sales." He said, "I do." No elaboration, no defensive explanation, no pivot to something that would make the answer sound better than it sounded. Just, "I do." I picked up my menu. If you have ever sat across from someone who was described to you as a consolation prize and understood, within the first 10 minutes of meeting them, that the person doing the describing did not know what they were looking at, drop a comment. Because that is a specific experience, and I think it happens more often than the people it happens to discuss it publicly. We were married 7 months later, not because I had fallen in love with Daniel Brooks in 7 months. I had not in the specific, overwhelming way that the word is sometimes used. I had come to trust him, which is a different thing, and which I have come to believe, after 9 years, is a more durable foundation. I had come to understand that he was precisely what he appeared to be, a man of specific, genuine intelligence, operating in a professional context that did not reflect the full scope of that intelligence, with the specific, unhurried patience of someone who has decided where he is going, and is not in a rush to explain the route to people who are not going with him. He told me, on the evening before our wedding, sitting in the small apartment he had lived in for 4 years, with the specific organized simplicity of a man who spends his money on things that compound, rather than things that impress. "They judged me by my paycheck. You judged me by my character. That's why we're going to win." I did not know at the time exactly what winning meant in his calculation. I was beginning to understand that it meant more than I had been told to expect. 9 years later, I stood in my kitchen and looked at the security panel, and then went to get Daniel from his home office. He came out with his phone still in his hand. The call concluded, the specific, unhurried movement of a man transitioning from one thing to the next without drama. He looked at the security panel. He looked at the 4 people standing in the rain at the gate. He said, I said, "Yes," he said. "What do you want to do?" I looked at the camera feed. My father in his older coat, my mother with her compressed posture, Sophia not meeting the camera, Jason looking at the gravel. I said, "I want to go to the door." He said, "Okay." He put his hand briefly on my shoulder. We walked to the front door together. The clinical trial enrollment software my team had built for Aurora Genomics wasn't supposed to teach me anything about myself. I was the engineer, not the patient. My job was schema design, data pipeline integrity, making sure 10,000 consenting participants' genetic results routed correctly to the right physicians without a single mismatch. But 6 months earlier, during a systems stress test, I'd used my own anonymized sample as a dummy record, a habit half the engineers on biodata teams develop, because testing with real structure beats testing with fake numbers. I hadn't thought about it again until the report auto-generated 3 weeks later and sat unopened, in a test environment. I wasn't supposed to be checking on a Saturday. I opened it anyway. Curiosity, not suspicion. The ancestry composition was fine. Ordinary. What stopped me was a flagged annotation in the carrier screening panel, a marker that, per the lab's own reference documentation, should have shown up in at least one biological parent's profile if it were inherited, and shouldn't exist at all if it wasn't. I knew enough about how these panels worked, from a year of sitting in requirements meetings with actual geneticists, to know this wasn't noise. It was the kind of anomaly that, in a real clinical context, triggered a callback. I didn't tell anyone at work. I didn't tell anyone at home. I sat with it for 2 weeks, doing the kind of arithmetic that had nothing to do with money. The first thing I did, quietly, on a Tuesday night after a release I'd shipped that morning, was pull up Helix DNA Labs, a private testing service unaffiliated with my company, the kind that mails a kit to your apartment in plain packaging. I paid for it with a card my family didn't know existed, linked to an account I'd opened the year. I got my first signing bonus and never mentioned at a single holiday dinner. The kit arrived 4 days later. I remember the sound of the box more than I remember opening it. A soft thud against my apartment door, delivered while I was on a call, walking a junior engineer through a deployment rollback. I stepped over it twice before I picked it up. I didn't open it that night. I left it on my kitchen counter for 3 days, next to a half-dead basil plant. Like if I ignored it long enough, it would resolve itself into something I didn't need to act on. On the 4th night, I made tea I didn't drink, sat at my counter at 11 p.m., and read the instructions twice before I did anything. Swab the inside of your cheek, 30 seconds per side. Seal it in the tube. Don't eat or drink for 30 minutes beforehand. I'd had the tea, so I waited, watching the clock on my microwave, feeling stupid for how much my hands were shaking over. Something this procedurally simple. I mailed it the next morning before work, dropping the prepaid envelope into a blue mailbox, 2 blocks from my office, instead of the one outside my apartment, for no reason I could fully explain to myself, except that I didn't want it anywhere near home. Then I waited. 2.5 weeks, which I now know is fast for these labs, but at the time felt like geological time. I kept working. That part surprised me. How normal my hands stayed on a keyboard while the rest of me sat in a holding pattern. I shipped 2 features. I ran a post-mortem on an outage that wasn't my fault and walked my team through it, without my voice shaking once. Compartmentalization I'd learned a long time ago wasn't a skill I'd built for work. It was a skill I'd built at family dinners, and work had simply been the first place it ever paid me back. I didn't tell my therapist either. Not at first. I'd been seeing Dr. Okafor every other week for 8 months, mostly to process, her word, not mine, the relational patterns in my family. I didn't bring this up in session until the week before the results came in, and even then I undersold it. I ordered a DNA test, I told her, just out of curiosity. Curiosity about what? I didn't have a good answer, so I gave her the honest one. I think I want proof of something. I don't know what yet. She didn't push. She asked what I thought I'd do with the proof once I had it, and I didn't have an answer for that either. I only knew that for the first time in my life, I was going to walk into a family conversation holding something they couldn't talk me out of. The email arrived on a Thursday at 6:47 a.m. Your DNA results are ready. I was already awake. I hadn't really slept, not properly, in 4 nights. Sitting on my apartment floor in running clothes, I had no intention of running in, laptop open on the coffee table. I didn't open it right away. I made coffee first. I drank half of it. I opened my work Slack and closed it again, without reading anything. Then I sat back down, opened the report, and read the ancestry breakdown first, because it was the part that felt safest. It was the relatives section that stopped my breathing. No close biological relative matches found in database that, on its own, meant nothing. Helix's database was smaller than 23andMe's. Plenty of real relatives go unmatched. But beneath it in the detailed report was the same carrier screening anomaly. Aurora's system had flagged 6 months earlier. This time analyzed against a broader reference panel, this time annotated with a note suggesting genetic counseling for discrepancies in expected parental inheritance patterns. It wasn't proof of who I was. It was proof that the story I'd been told about who I was didn't add up mathematically, which, for someone who'd spent her entire career trusting mathematics over the things people told her, was somehow worse than an answer. It was an open variable. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because I expected to, and I didn't. I sat very still, the way I used to sit at family dinners, and I did what I'd always done when something didn't compute. I went looking for more data. That was the night I found Dr. Sarah Mitchell's practice, a board-certified genetic counselor, 2 T-stops from my apartment, with a specialty listed plainly on her website. Parentage and relatedness testing, discrepancy counseling, clinical grade confirmatory analysis. I read her bio 4 times. I read 3 patient testimonials, all anonymized, all describing some version of the sentence. I hadn't let myself think yet. I needed to know for certain. I called her office the next morning before my first meeting. Voice flat and professional, the same voice I used to escalate production incidents. I booked an appointment for the following Tuesday. A clinical grade test, processed under a documented chain of custody, the kind of result that couldn't be waved away in a family, meeting the way a mail order kit could be. I told no one. Not my roommate from college, not the 2 coworkers I was closest to, not my therapist beyond what I'd already said. I went to that appointment alone on a Tuesday afternoon. Took an extended lunch I logged as a personal appointment on my work calendar, and sat in a small, clean office while Dr. Mitchell explained, kindly and without urgency, exactly how the testing process worked and what kinds of answers it could and couldn't give me. Sometimes, she said, capping the swab kit and labeling it in front of me, initialing the chain of custody form, people come in expecting one kind of answer, and the data tells a very different story. I just want you prepared for that possibility, whichever direction it goes. I've been prepared for a different story my whole life, I told her. I just never had anything to back it up before. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't need to. She simply told me the results would take 7 to 10 business days, gave me her direct line instead of the office's general one, and shook my hand like she already understood. This wasn't going to be a routine case. I went back to work that afternoon and ran a sprint planning meeting 40 minutes later, like nothing in my life was currently suspended in a lab 3 miles away, waiting to tell me who I actually was. If you've ever sat in a waiting room, holding a question you weren't sure you wanted answered, drop a comment. Tell me how long you waited before you finally asked. For the next 9 days, I went home each night and built. Not code, paper. A folder, physical, the old-fashioned kind. The kind I'd never once needed in a career built entirely on databases. Into it went the Aurora anomaly printout from 6 months earlier, the Helix mail order results, Dr. Mitchell's intake paperwork, and a single page of notes in my own handwriting that I didn't let myself reread too often, because rereading it made my chest do something I didn't have bandwidth for during a release week. At the top of that page, underlined twice, I'd written one line that wasn't a question anymore. It was an instruction to myself, the kind I'd give a junior engineer who kept asking permission for something they already had the authority to do. Stop asking them to explain you. Get the data and let the data explain them. On the 9th night, my phone rang with a number I'd saved under Dr. Mitchell, genetic counselor, and I let it ring twice before I picked it up, because some part of me, the part that had spent 29 years bracing before opening any door that mattered, needed those 2 extra seconds. Emily, she said, and something in the careful gentleness of her voice told me, before a single fact left her mouth, that whatever she was about to say was going to undo a story I'd been told my entire life. I want to walk through this with you slowly. Are you somewhere you can talk for a few minutes? I sat down on my kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, the folder open on my lap, like evidence I'd already half memorized, and said the only word I had left in me. Yes. I want to walk through this slowly, Dr. Mitchell said again, and I heard the small click of a folder opening on her end of the line, paper against paper, the sound of someone about to read me my own life back to me in numbers. Okay, I said. The test we ran compares your sample directly against the reference profiles you provided, your mother's and father's samples, which I understand you collected separately, with their consent forms on file. That part had taken me 4 days to arrange, longer than the actual swabbing. I'd asked my parents for a favor for a work project, a harmless lie about a genomics company doing internal research on family inheritance patterns in software, something close enough to true that I didn't flinch saying it out loud at their kitchen table. My mother had been irritated by the inconvenience, more annoyed at having to interrupt her gardening than curious about why her daughter, the software engineer, needed a cheek swab. My father had asked, half joking, swirling his coffee like he did, before every joke he thought was clever, if he was finally going to find out. He had a daughter who was secretly some kind of genius, and laughed at his own line for longer than it deserved, the way he laughed at most of his own jokes. Neither of them had asked a single follow-up question. Not what the company was called, not what the study was for, not why I needed it in a sealed tube instead of a normal swab. That, more than almost anything else in this whole process, told me how little they thought I noticed things, how little they imagined I was capable of noticing. Based on the markers we tested, Dr. Mitchell continued, the probability of biological maternity between you and the woman whose sample you labeled Linda is 99.998%. The probability of biological paternity between you and the man labeled Robert is 99.994%. I sat very still on my kitchen floor, knees pulled up, phone pressed so hard against my ear, it had started to ache. You're their biological daughter, Emily. As biological as it's possible to confirm with this kind of testing. There's no ambiguity in these numbers. I want to be completely clear about that before we go any further. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't relief, and it wasn't joy. Even though those were the feelings I'd half rehearsed for this exact sentence across 29 years of being told, in 100 small ways, that I didn't quite fit into the shape of my own family. What I felt instead was rage, clean, cold, and very, very specific. The kind of rage that doesn't shout, that just sits in your sternum and recalculates everything you've ever been told, line by line, like a system flagging every record that no longer matches its schema. Because if I was theirs, biologically, undeniably, mathematically theirs, then every cousin's offhand remark passed off as a joke, every, "You don't really look like either of them, do you?" Every time my mother let a silence sit in a room, instead of correcting someone who implied, I was somehow lesser attached to this family. Every holiday where Jason and Olivia got the family stories and the family warmth, and I got the family disclaimers. None of that had ever been about biology at all. It had been a choice, a decision made by two adults, repeated for nearly 3 decades, that I was the one who got treated like an outsider in her own bloodline. And biology, it turned out, had nothing whatsoever to do with that decision. There's something else, Dr. Mitchell said, and her voice shifted into a register. I now recognize, looking back on it, as the one professionals use right before they hand you something they already know is going to detonate quietly in your chest. What? You asked me to run an expanded relatedness panel. Not just a parent-child comparison, but full sibling concordance, since you provided buccal samples from 2 additional family members as well. She paused, and I heard paper shift again. I want to confirm. You collected those the same way you collected your parents' samples? Independently, without their direct knowledge of the specific test being run? I had. A wine cork pulled too hard from a bottle at a Sunday dinner. 3 months earlier, swabbed afterward in my parked car outside their house, while telling myself I was being paranoid that this was a waste of a perfectly good lab kit, a used coffee cup of Olivia's, that I'd taken home in my bag after visiting her dorm during finals week the year before, telling myself I'd test it eventually, not admitting to myself until the kit was already sealed and labeled in my freezer what eventually actually meant. I collected them, I said. I know how that sounds. It's not my place to comment on how you obtained your samples, Dr. Mitchell said gently, only to tell you what the analysis shows. Are you ready? Yes, neither sample shows any biological relatedness to Robert or Linda. Not as their children, not at any meaningful concordance level. The markers don't show partial matches consistent with half-siblings either, which would be the most likely alternative explanation if there'd been, say, an affair on either side at some point. Genetically, based on everything we tested, Jason and Olivia are not related to your parents at all, not partially, not in any biological sense we can detect. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Dr. Mitchell, to her credit, let the silence sit instead of rushing to fill it with reassurance. The way every other adult in my life had always rushed to fill silences that made them uncomfortable. Are you sure? I finally said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. That the samples weren't compromised somehow? Cross-contaminated? Mixed up at the lab? We ran each one twice, against separate control batches, specifically because of how significant a result like this is. This isn't the kind of finding we report casually. I wanted to rule out lab error completely before I picked up the phone tonight. I'm confident in these numbers, Emily. I wouldn't be telling you this if I weren't. I thought about every dinner table I'd ever sat at in that house. Every first real, doctor in the family toast, delivered with my father's particular flourish. The one he used to close deals. Every time my mother had described my entire career as the computer thing, dismissively, in the same breath she used to turn, almost theatrically, into a different and warmer woman. The moment Jason mentioned a promotion, or Olivia mentioned a rotation, I thought about being 9 years old, standing in that kitchen being told gently, but unmistakably, that I should be more grateful, more careful, more willing to take up less space at a table that, as it turned out, more mine by blood than anyone else's sitting at it. Language that had only ever been aimed at me, never once at the two siblings who weren't, as of tonight, biologically theirs at all. Something in my chest didn't break in that moment. That's the part people don't expect when you tell them this story. And it's the part I still have trouble explaining to anyone who hasn't lived it. It didn't break. It settled. The way a structure settles, once an engineer finally identifies which beam was load-bearing the entire time, and which ones had just been decoration, expensive and convincing decoration, dressed up to look structural when they'd never been holding anything up at all. Emily, Dr. Mitchell said. After the silence had stretched long enough that she clearly wanted to check I was still there. I know this is an enormous amount to take in at once. Do you want to schedule a follow-up session so we can talk through next steps when you've had some time to process? I'm fine, I said, and I meant it in the specific, narrow, technical sense that I wasn't crying, and my hands had finally stopped their small, steady tremor against the phone case. I think I just need to understand what this means, practically. What are my options from here? Practically, it means there's almost certainly an explanation your parents have that predates you, or at least predates your conscious memory. Something from years before you were born, possibly. A hospital mix-up, an undisclosed private adoption, something they've known for decades and simply chosen never to disclose. I can't tell you what that explanation is, Emily. I can only tell you, with very high confidence, what the data itself says happened, and what it says didn't happen. That sentence. I can only tell you what the data says, was, without exaggeration, the most honest thing anyone in my entire life had said to me in 29 years, and she'd said it about a stranger's lab results over the phone at 9 at night. Not even about me specifically. Not even trying to be profound. I thanked her. I asked 2 more clarifying questions about chain of custody documentation, and whether the reports would hold up if a lawyer ever needed them formalized. Questions that surprised even me, with how calm and procedural they sounded coming out of my own mouth. She answered both patiently, told me she'd email the full certified reports within 48 hours, and reminded me, kindly, that I didn't have to act on any of this immediately. That some people sit with results like these for months before deciding what, if anything, to do with them. I didn't tell her. I already knew I wasn't going to be one of those people. I hung up and sat on my kitchen floor for a long time after the call ended, the manila folder open beside me on the tile. 3 lab reports fanned out like a hand of cards. I now understood I'd been dealt face down my entire life, while everyone else at every family table had apparently been allowed to see their own hands from the very beginning. I didn't cry that night either. I made a list instead, on the back of an old grocery receipt, because it was the only paper within reach. The same instinct that had carried me through every production outage I'd ever managed at 2 in the morning, with half my team asleep and a system down. What do I know? What don't I know yet? What's my next concrete action item? What I knew, written in my own cramped handwriting under a faint coffee ring. I was Linda and Robert's biological daughter. Full stop, no ambiguity. Confirmed at 99.98 and 99.994%. Jason and Olivia were not, at any detectable level. Someone had built an entire family mythology. We took her in out of kindness. The exact sentence I'd heard since, before I could remember being old enough to question it. on a lie that ran precisely backward from the actual, provable truth. What I didn't know, written underneath with a question mark. I pressed hard enough to nearly tear the receipt. Why? Whether they'd always known, from the very beginning, or discovered it later, and simply chose silence over disruption. Whether it was a hospital's mistake, decades ago, that they'd quietly uncovered and buried rather than face, or something they'd chosen deliberately, with intention, for reasons I couldn't yet imagine. Whether Jason and Olivia knew anything about any of this at all, or were every bit as much in the dark as I had been my entire life. Just sitting comfortably on the warm side of the lie instead of the punished side of it, unaware they'd ever been anywhere else. What I didn't write down, because some things don't belong on a list. Even when you're someone who organizes her entire emotional life into lists, was the moment, sometime around 2 a.m, sitting against my kitchen cabinets, with my tea gone cold beside me, when I stopped feeling like I needed them to apologize, and started feeling like I simply needed them to see the report, not because I wanted forgiveness or softness from them anymore. I'd stopped needing that the way you eventually stop needing a language you no longer live in. The words still technically known, but no longer reaching for instinctively. I needed them to see it because I was done. Completely and finally done. Being the only person in that family who had to do the arithmetic alone, at midnight, on a kitchen floor, with nobody else in the world. Even aware there was math being done at all. If you've ever found out the story you were told about yourself was actually the story of someone else entirely, drop a comment below. I want to know how long it took you to stop feeling crazy and start feeling certain instead. The next morning, I didn't go back to Dr. Mitchell's office, even though part of me wanted the comfort of her calm, clinical voice again. Instead, I drove to a copy shop 2 blocks from my apartment, the kind with humming fluorescent lights and a bored teenager behind the counter, and had 4 certified sets of every report, printed and spiral bound. 1 for myself, 1 for a lawyer I hadn't hired yet, but had already started quietly researching at 3 a.m, between bouts of staring at my ceiling and 2 more I genuinely hadn't decided what to do with. Not yet, though some part of me already suspected. I drove to my parents' house that following Sunday, for what was, on the surface, an entirely ordinary family dinner. Pot roast, the smell of it hitting me. The second I opened the front door, the same smell that had filled that house every Sunday of my childhood. Jason's fiancé running 15 minutes late because of traffic on the interstate. Olivia talking animated and bright about a rotation she was starting in 2 weeks, gesturing with her fork in a way that reminded everyone at the table, without her meaning to, of exactly how much room she'd always been allowed to take up. I sat at the same end of the table I'd always sat at, the one slightly outside the warm center of things, near enough to participate, but far enough to be easily overlooked. And for the first time in 29 years, I felt something shift in my body as I sat down. Not anger exactly, not yet, but something quieter and more permanent. I felt, for the first time in my life, like I wasn't the one in that room who didn't belong. I was, as far as I could tell, the only one at that table who actually knew what the room was. The folder sat in my car, in the trunk, under a blanket I kept for emergencies. 4 bound copies of a truth that was going to rearrange every chair at this table before the month was out. I ate my pot roast. I answered Olivia's questions about Seattle. I let my mother call my work the computer thing. One more time, the very last time, and I didn't correct her, because for once I wasn't trying to be heard. I was simply waiting for the right room to put the evidence on the table, instead of my words. The genetic counseling office Dr. Mitchell worked from had a second, larger conference room used for exactly this kind of meeting. Family disclosure sessions, she'd explained when I asked, where multiple parties needed to receive sensitive results together, with a professional present to manage what could otherwise become an uncontrolled situation. I'd booked it 3 weeks in advance, under a vague description on the calendar. Invite I sent my parents, family health matter. Please all attend, this is important. I didn't tell them what it was about. I'd learned by then that giving them advance notice only gave them time to build a story before the facts arrived. I wanted the facts to arrive. First, getting all 5 of us in the same room had taken more engineering than most production migrations I'd run. My father initially balked at taking time off on a Thursday afternoon. My mother assumed it was about a health diagnosis and spent 2 days quietly panicking, judging by the texts she sent me that I didn't answer beyond, "We'll talk Thursday." Jason asked, bluntly, if this was some kind of inheritance thing, which told me more about where his mind lived than he probably intended. Olivia, mid-rotation, almost didn't come at all, until I called her directly and said 6 words I'd never said to her before. "I need you there, please." She came. The conference room was small and deliberately unremarkable. Beige walls, a round table instead of a rectangular one, soft chairs instead of the hard plastic kind, all chosen, Dr. Mitchell told me later, specifically to keep difficult conversations from feeling adversarial. A box of tissues sat in the exact center of the table, the kind of detail you don't notice until you understand why it's there. I arrived first, the folder in my bag, my hands steady in a way that almost unsettled me. My parents arrived together 12 minutes later, my father still in his work blazer, my mother already searching my face for clues. The way she used to search report cards for any grade that wasn't an A. Jason came next, checking his phone twice before he sat down, clearly annoyed at having left work early, for what he still assumed was a financial conversation. Olivia arrived last, still in scrubs, looking exhausted and faintly worried. The only person in the room who seemed to sense, correctly, that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be small. Dr. Mitchell introduced herself with the calm, pressed warmth of someone who had done this exact kind of meeting more times than any of us could imagine. "Emily asked me to be here today to help walk your family through some genetic testing results. I want to say up front that my role here isn't to interpret motives or assign blame. It's to make sure everyone understands the science clearly. What you do with that understanding is between the 5 of you." "Genetic testing," my father repeated, glancing at me. Is everything okay? Are you sick?" "I'm not sick," I said. "I'm just done not knowing things that everyone else apparently decided I didn't need to know." My mother's hand moved, almost imperceptibly, toward my father's under the table. It was such a small motion that I might have missed it 3 years earlier. I didn't miss it now. I'd spent 3 weeks studying exactly this kind of behavior, in the footage of family dinners. I kept replaying in my memory, and I recognized it instantly for what it was. The reflex of 2 people bracing for something they'd been bracing for, quietly, for a very long time. Dr. Mitchell opened her own folder, distinct from mine, containing the lab's official documentation, chain of custody forms, certified signatures, the kind of paperwork that exists specifically, so no one in a room like this can later claim the numbers were invented. "Emily came to my office several weeks ago, requesting confirmatory parentage testing," she said. Comparing her own DNA against samples she identified as belonging to her mother, Linda, and her father, Robert. "I want to be very clear that these results have been verified twice, against separate control batches, due to the significance of what they show." "What do they show?" my mother asked, her voice thin in a way I'd genuinely never heard before. "The probability that Emily is the biological daughter of both Linda and Robert is in excess of 99.99%. There is no ambiguity in this result. Emily is your biological child." The room went very quiet. I watched my father's jaw move, like he was about to say something, and then stop. I watched my mother's eyes fill fast, the way they did at Olivia's toasts, except this time there was no warmth behind it, only something closer to fear. "Of course she is," my father finally said, too quickly, the practiced ease of his sales voice cracking slightly at the edges. "We never said otherwise. You told me I was taken in," I said. My voice didn't shake. I'd practiced this part more than any other, alone in my apartment, until it came out flat and even, like reading a status report. "Since I was old enough to understand sentences, you told me, directly and repeatedly, that I should be grateful you raised me those words. Grateful you raised me, not grateful you had me. There's a difference, and I think you both know exactly what that difference is." Jason shifted in his seat. "Wait, what is this actually about? Is somebody else's name on a birth certificate or something?" "There's a second part," Dr. Mitchell said, before either parent could answer. "Emily also requested relatedness testing on samples belonging to Jason and Olivia." Jason's posture changed instantly, the way it did in any meeting when he sensed a conversation turning toward him. You tested my DNA without asking me? I'll address how the samples were obtained separately if that becomes relevant. Dr. Mitchell said, calm and unhurried. But right now I want to focus on what the results show. Because I think that's the part this family needs to understand before anything else. She turned a page. Neither Jason's nor Olivia's genetic profile shows any biological relationship to Robert or Linda. Not as their children, not as half-siblings. There's no detectable biological relatedness at all. Silence again, but a different kind this time. Heavier, the kind that doesn't ask questions, because it's still trying to process whether it heard correctly. That's not possible, Olivia said quietly, and I watched her face do something I'd never seen it do before. A kind of collapse that started behind her eyes and moved slowly down to her mouth. Mom gave birth to me. I've seen the photos. I've seen the hospital bracelet. I'm not in a position to explain how this occurred, Dr. Mitchell said gently. I can only confirm what the genetic data shows. If there's a hospital record discrepancy, that would need to be investigated separately, through hospital archives or legal channels, not through this testing alone. My mother had gone completely white. My father's hand, the one not holding my mother's, had curled into a fist on the table, knuckles pale. Mom, Jason said, and for the first time in his life, I heard something in his voice that wasn't smug or dismissive. It was small. It was the voice of someone realizing in real time that the ground under him had never actually been there. Mom, what is she talking about? My mother didn't answer. My father did, after a long silence, in the voice of a man who had clearly rehearsed this moment in his head for years, hoping he'd never have to use it. There was a mix-up, he said, at the hospital. Decades ago, 2 infants, you two, were sent home with the wrong families the same week, the same maternity ward. We didn't find out until years later, when a routine pediatric test flagged something during a checkup. By then, he stopped. His jaw worked again. By then, we'd already raised you both for years. We loved you both already. We weren't going to undo that. And Emily? Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily came along a few years after that, my mother said, finally speaking, her voice cracking in a way I'd genuinely never heard before in 29 years. She was ours. Truly ours, biologically, from the start. We were terrified. Terrified that if anyone ever found out about the mix-up with you two, we'd lose you both to whatever family you were supposed to have ended up with. So we built a story. We told Emily she was the one who'd been taken in, out of kindness, because it was easier to make one child feel like an outsider than to risk losing 2. I sat, very still while she said this, the same stillness I'd practiced at every family dinner of my entire life. Except this time the stillness wasn't submission. It was simply the only posture precise enough to hold what I was feeling. You decided, I said slowly, that the easiest lie to tell was the one that made me feel unwanted in my own family, for almost 30 years. We didn't think of it that way at the time, my father said. I don't care how you thought of it at the time, I said. I care that you had 30 years to choose a different story, and every single year, you chose the one that cost me the most. Jason was quiet, staring at the table, working through math of his own. Math I recognized instantly, because I'd been doing it my entire life, and he was only just starting. Olivia had her hand pressed over her mouth, tears falling freely now. Not for me, not yet, but for the foundation of her own identity, quietly giving way beneath her. I reached into my bag and set the folder on the table, the same folder I'd carried into that office, into that pot roast dinner, into 3 weeks of silence while I waited for the right room. I didn't open it. I didn't need to anymore. Dr. Mitchell's documentation had already done the work mine was built to do. I'm not here to blow up this family, I said, looking at each of them in turn. My mother, my father, Jason, Olivia. I'm here because I spent 29 years being told a story that wasn't true, and I needed you to hear, out loud, in a room with someone who can't be argued with, exactly how untrue it was. What happens now? My mother asked, and for the first time in my entire life, she was asking me a real question instead of issuing me a correction. That's not actually mine to answer, I said. Jason and Olivia have their own decisions to make about whether they want to find their biological families. That's their math, not mine. I just needed mine to finally add up. I stood, gathered the folder I hadn't needed to open, and looked at the 4 of them sitting around that round, deliberately unthreatening table. My biological parents, who had spent 3 decades making me feel like the only fraudulent thing in a house built almost entirely on fraud, and my siblings, who were only now beginning to understand they'd been standing on the same shaky ground I had, just from the other side of it. I love you, I said. To all of them, and none of them in particular, but I'm done doing the math alone. I walked out of that conference room and into a parking lot full of ordinary cars under an ordinary gray sky, and for the first time since I was 9 years old, the arithmetic in my chest finally came out even.